I just wanted to say yes, thank you for the talk, which I really, really enjoyed. And I have three comments slash questions. I don't know if you want to take them one by one or all together. Two of them are related to the perception cognition divide or absence of it. And the last one is related to the metacognitive monitoring. So I think I'll start with the perception cognition divide first. And I guess I wanted to immediately mention that I agree with you on that. Even if you adopt predictive processing, you don't necessarily have to accept the absence of the divide. I think what predictive processing tend to suggest more is a certain continuity between the two, and the ability of them to be accommodated by quite similar mechanisms. And when we start to think about this continuity between perception and cognition, so the immediate question is sort of how this continuity comes to be and what is the structure of the hierarchical systems that are involved. And I think this is actually quite a popular opinion among the PP proponents that cognition is somewhere above perception in the hierarchies. And sometimes people tend to talk about that as sort of more of a just upper part, lower part. You have a more specific proposal of what you want to call thought. And this gives I think it gives a very nice definition, but I'm a little bit worried that maybe it's problematic. And I want you to maybe clarify if I have a misunderstanding in what you're sort of call the hierarchies or levels in your talk. Maybe that's where it comes from. So my worry is that cognition itself or thought itself is also compositionally structured to a certain extent, right? You may not necessarily agree with that, but I think that that's a relatively controversial claim, and that's something that predictive processing seem to support. And so when you start to think about that, right? It's the uppermost level, as you say, that's not predicted by anything else, but the sort of these constituents of thought, whatever you want to call them, they are. And then it seems that cognition starts to leak down again and sort of blend with perception, because it seems that this sort of question of content and concepts and what they are and how they're related to sort of perceptual information, it becomes really important again. So you can't really, if you want to talk about sort of cognition as a hierarchy structured thing somehow, I think this definition is a little bit problematic. And even if you want to talk about so this entire cluster being somewhat separate, right? This lowest level of thought is still connected to perception in a way that it kind of makes it bleed through. So that's kind of first question. I don't know if you want to talk about that first, or would you
like go ahead maybe with the three, and I will try and see whether I can.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yes. So the second point related to that sort of type of structure is not actually my point. This is something that I've came across before. I think it's from Williams, a paper by Williams, 2018, where he talks about this sort of the inherent problematicity of this kind of thought on top situation, and that's related to sort of the nature of these hierarchies again. And so one popular opinion is that it is all about the spatiotemporal scale, for example, or the level of abstraction, where you have the highest sort of level of abstraction or conceptual content right on top, and then sort of the respective hierarchies going down. But we tend to be able to flexibly reason about phenomena on all sorts of scales, right? We also tend to be able to reason about phenomena on different levels of abstraction and things that don't seem to be causally connected or sort of play a causal role in perception at all. So that seems to be a problematic kind of approach. And finally, we, like, independently on how we structure, or sort of what is the basis for that kind of structure with cognition on top and perception at the bottom, right? We have this problem of necessarily sort of going through all the adjacent levels in order to get from one sort of aspect of this hierarchy to another aspect of this hierarchy. Right, and that does not seem to be the case in thought, and that doesn't seem to be the sort of situation that we see, right? And the final comment about the metacognitive monitoring. So I'm not entirely sure. You say that there's a lot of evidence for our ability to sort of reflectively assess the role of cognition, right? I don't know whether that's necessarily the case, because we have this sort of example of post-facto rationalization, right? And it seems to be relatively uncontroversial that sometimes the explanations that we give for our decisions do not actually correspond to the actual reasons for those decisions, or do not reflect the underlying sort of decision-making process. So, and I find it very difficult to sort of try to argue that decision-making is entirely perception-based process. So it is indeed a higher-level cognition-based thing that we still cannot really adequately assess through metacognitive monitoring, right? Yeah, so I think that the predictive processing gives a very good idea of sort of the potential decision-making mechanisms, right? But what the sort of the relationship between that mechanism and the metacognition is a separate question that I don't think has been like adequately really addressed yet. And so the final sort of comment related to that is I was kind of surprised with the results of the second study, and I don't know how to quite interpret them. But one suggestion that I have is that perhaps because the luminance and morphology do typically go together, right? This kind of prediction may be deemed quite reliable overall, and maybe so there is not actually accuracy confidence decrease that can be just immediately observed just through this kind of one interaction in the experiment. And maybe that's the reason, like you didn't notice that, because that it could be a longer term effect there. Yeah, so that's kind of the main questions.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. So, or that's a very good point there. Maybe I will start with the latest one, which is fresher in my mind. So on this metacognitive awareness, I think that one thing I will hold on is to say that this form of the capacity of thought to update itself through reflecting on its own decision or content, or that will tap into the first question, but to reflect on itself is really something distinctive that you would not have this form of, and you could have loops of control, but we need to make sure that to characterize this loop of control and monitoring in such a way that at this level is distinctive. There's a big debate on the nature of metacognition. What you're pointing at as evidence that we are indeed not necessarily metacognitively aware of our decisions, I totally accept. What I was trying to say is that at least as far as the evidence relates to perception and confidence, then, and it's not, for instance, I wouldn't have expected that you could stop participants and ask them, do you think you're doing something wrong? And tell us what you think you're doing something wrong, right? This is a form of minimal metacognitive monitoring. The fact that you just ask on a trial-by-trial basis, how sure are you? You just need to, it's a sort of light monitoring that doesn't requires you to access the reasons for it. It's just that detection of conflict or influence that we were, so it could be kind of subtle and in a way a bit poor. So we're really tapping into the lowest kind of metacognitive awareness, like, is there something fishy going on here?
All right.
And it was surprising not to find it, because on in other perceptual tasks, for instance in the multisensory case, people are quite capable of detecting some degrees of conflict between perceptual cues, which have to do with the way they fit, for instance, in the phonological categories.
Right.
So when you have this classic McGurk effect where what you see and what you hear can be congruent or incongruent, and people were asked, so they report hearing the same thing.
Right.
But if you ask them how confident they are, if they're presented with a perfectly congruent
Mm-hmm.
stimulus, they are pretty confident. So they're more confident than when they're presented with a non-congruent stimulus that they've reconciled and report to have heard exactly similarly. So if you ask them, are they the same? They say yes. And if you say, which one are you more certain was, say, a dog? And then they say, just pick one. And they're well above chance in picking the one that results from the conflict. So this form of conflict monitoring we're expecting to find, again, the way I presented it with the example of the McGurk, it's to say, well, it's as if you have this representation of what this more cognitive representation of what a concept, a phoneme would be, what kind of, how it looks and how it sees, so that when things fit perfectly within your cognitive category, you're confident, and when they don't, you're not. So that would be the analogy. I'm not saying we need to analyze the McGurk in that case. That was the analogy we were after.
Yeah. I was just wondering whether they're also disanalogous in some important way, and perhaps the particular example that you had in your presentation actually is more sort of cognitively involved in some way, or more like there are more associations with sort of, I don't know, other conceptual categories or some parts of I don't know, the sort of more structured beliefs, right? Than in McGurk effect. And like if it's the case that we're worse at monitoring our cognition than our perception, let's say, that it could be actually taken as evidence that cognition is more heavily involved in this case. And that's a very like far-fetched kind of yes thing to say, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure that they're exactly identical here.
So and that's why at the end I think we need to really think about this updating, which I tended to think we're just like simply going on happily together with wherever you would find any effect. You would say, well, if it's responsive to thought by being responsive to verbal instructions, it's something that will also show up in terms of reflective awareness. And actually, it's not the case. So I think maybe there's a very simple way in this to say, well, and you have the cognitive resources to change it and control it when instructed, but you don't have the cognitive resources by yourself to fully deploy the origins of the bias at the cognitive level and then correct for it.
Mm-hmm.
So something like that would be true. I think it comes to your two questions about the relation between the kind of distinctions that I'm putting forward and other, like in terms of compositionality or in terms of content. Again, starting with your second question, it's true that.
So, sorry.
Yes.
I'm afraid I've got to
let's
make a little break because we have to introduce also every question.
Well,
and maybe we will have time to sum up everything.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe the answer to the question you can. Well, okay.
Okay.
We're running a bit late. Sorry.
So, I mean, I guess on this I will be short because I agree with you that a pure distinction in terms of more general and more specific content will not do, simply to identify what would be characteristic of thought versus perception. I would think that compositionality and the is a much more promising way, but altogether I would hope that one could almost do without having to identify strictly perception and cognition, or at least as far as I'm concerned, cognition with strictly one type of content.
Mm-hmm.
So you would find different updating, resting, or using different types of content, so more abstract, more specific, more conceptual or non-conceptual, but not necessarily tie up the fate of thought with one type of content.
But that seems like we're coming back to the sort of fuzziness of boundaries again here, if we start to think about this way. And I mean, I'm not necessarily saying there's no distinction, but that distinction becomes blurry again between cognition and perception.
No need.
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
I'm afraid I have to put this question in freezer. Maybe we can warm
Okay.
it up later. Harry,
Hi, thank you,
in.
Sophia.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. So I'll start by saying thank you, Ophelia, for that really interesting talk and for that really important empirical work. So I've got lots of things to say, but I'm going to break it down to three for now. The first question I'd like to ask, I don't think it's an easy question, but it's not an adversarial question at all. And it's really kind of a sociology of philosophy question. A sociology of philosophy and psychology question. So, as I'm sure we all know, the debate on top-down effects on perception goes back more than a century, probably, thinking of things like the Perky effect and New Look psychology. Meanwhile, debates have been raging in philosophy about mental architecture. Well, maybe back since Plato, but I mean, obviously, they had a flourishing in the 80s. And yet, it seems like these debates have really taken off in both philosophy and psychology. Debates about the cognition-perception boundary and about cognitive penetration. In the last 10, 15 years in philosophy, and I guess in psychology too. So one question I have is this all a response to predictive coding? Or what are the things that have changed to make this such a central issue in a lot of philosophical and psychological discourse? And I was just curious if you had any reflections on that. I guess following Sophia, maybe I'll mention my other two questions. So the first thing, was the sociology of philosophy question. The second comes down to really why we're interested in a perception-cognition boundary at all. And I think we can say two of the leading ways of drawing the boundary. On the one hand, to do it in terms of representational format or perhaps representational content. This is the route I think broadly taken by people like Ned Block and Tyler Burge. Another way of doing it is in terms of encapsulation and modularity. Obviously, this is another classic strategy. And I think one part of the appeal of these two different ways is they latch onto something psychologically or phenomenologically obvious about the way that perception and cognition seem to differ introspectively. And that is part of what I think makes them appealing candidate ways of drawing the distinction to begin with. So I was interested in hearing what you think your proposed way of drawing the boundary, how that latches on to whether that has the same kind of introspective, psychological, or phenomenological appeal, and how you could sort of motivate it from the subjective point of view. The final question, and this is sort of an invitation to speculate a little bit, perhaps. I was thinking whether there could be other sort of prima mobile in the mind, unpredicted predictors, and so you might think perhaps some language processing systems, some subpersonal parsers, for example, might not be predicted by other parts of the mind. Who knows? Mental imagery is another candidate. And so on the one hand, you might think these are sort of a challenge to the idea that we should just define cognition as unpredicted prediction or something like that. So I was curious as to whether you would say about those, oh yeah, there could be other forms of predictive mechanisms that aren't predicted that wouldn't count as cognition. So unpredicted prediction is only part of what goes into a constitutive account of what cognition is. Or whether you would say, look, maybe you're skeptical about those cases, but if they came out, then we should update our view of cognition to include those. Okay, so those are the three: the sociology of philosophy, the appeal of drawing the boundary in this way, and finally, could there be other unpredicted predictors?
Good, very good. Great questions covering a lot of different things. On the sociology one, I will be I'll be giving you just one shot because there will be many. We should have a beer and talk about this. But I think that the concern here is about the epistemology, and as you said, from Plato onward, and the fact that I think for a long time perceptual justification seemed to be something we thought was robust, and then we get more and more evidence of how biased actually all or perception is. And here I would say why does it become more important and followed by, and predictive accounts are just stressing that fact, is that we're no longer just concerned by things as strong as illusions and hallucinations in the problem of, it's not as if, or this case of Duck Rabbit, where suddenly you have the same stimulus and cognition could make you flip, and what we have is really something which is absolutely pervasive, where everything seems to be somehow drawing on the expectations that we have. And that's why I think the problem has gone from being specific to a few cases to actually being very, very general for philosophers. At the same time, it's interesting that when you look at the perceptual evidence and in cognitive science, only cases like the race lightness actually bias really resist thorough investigation as being still good candidates. So there is here kind of mismatch that I think we're still sociologically haven't totally overcome. I actually think that multisensory perception is a great case of, because we have a lot of influence of concepts on integration, but it is more on the spatial temporal relation between stimuli. So the way we associate or combine sensory information is very sensitive to what we expect and know. So you wouldn't do the same thing whether you know it's a kettle or a car or something. So I think we still have a lot of these general cases hanging around. But as I said, my main response to this question would be to say now we're looking at biases, and these biases are, at least they could be anywhere, and we can find them by talking more to the scientists. That's one part. The second, about the phenomenological evidence, it's very interesting. I never thought about the having to defend the account in terms of what would be the. I would just give again a partial response because it would take longer to consider everything. I would think that it's quite appealing to think that the only thing we can really control and reflect upon are cognitive content. So that's especially regarding this form of the certainty and so I wouldn't think that if you imagine a creature which only has perception, we wouldn't give it this power of reflecting on its certainty or being able to provide in a fuller sense some justification and reports about what they. So I would go in that direction. I think this is tapping into something that's in the same way in which you would think that you could grant perception to a creature without granting them the mastery of concepts, and that's once you want things to be combined, you would need to grant them things like concepts and a form of combination. I think that along this line, once you grant thought to a creature, it's likely that the form. At the same time, I said that for animals, you could have higher level cognition without that updating. No, I'm not doing a fully satisfactory response here.
I mean, I don't know if it's of any interest perhaps or any relevance, but I was thinking about this difference perhaps between thought and perception, thought as being typically under voluntary control, for example. But I mean, then there are these interesting cases of things like intrusive thoughts, obsessive thoughts, and there are some ways in which thought, at least on occasion, can present itself to us as an external thing intruding upon our lives, in much the same way as perception.
Yeah, it's interesting that that you mentioned that in terms of control. I would think that again so by association you could have a trigger, an horizontal triggering. So you think about something with triggers and triggers, well, that wouldn't be still intrusive. When interestingly intrusive thoughts are really found in people who have a deficit in metacognitive performance. So this lack of control, people with schizophrenia and things, various like clinical cases also. There are deficits of metacognition also in depression, when you have this tendency to sort of have these thoughts that then don't stick and you ruminate. And so yeah, it's true that might be a case where I would be consistent in saying, well, of course there you can give me cases where thought is not controlled, but I will stick to the fact that it is a characteristic of thought that it is controlled, because there's something wrong going on with thought when you have this intrusive aspect, something along this line. Thank you for the suggestion. I'll think about that. Your third point is a very fair one as well on this respect, is that it's true that I've run the argument as if, okay, when now we have this unpredicted predictors, unpredictable predictors, and look, call them thought, and it's open to the challenge of saying, well, look, I give you another unpredictable predictor. And here we have all sorts of reasons not to think that this is at the higher level of the hierarchy, or to consider this as cognitive in some sense. Fair challenge, and I take your point about the mental imagery. Here I would be, at least with that candidate, I'm not running through others, looking again more closely at the evidence, I would be quite okay thinking that if we debate about the status of mental imagery, it will not come out as an unpredicted predictor. I think that imagery actually is quite systematically bottom-up driven. So it's not sui generis in that sense. Or it's predicted by cognition. So it's either driven by thought. So I ask you to imagine a unicorn, or when you have another case of it will be triggered notably when you look at multisensory imagery. So there are many cases where people start to report visual images, but actually we can think that they're triggered by interoceptive events or auditory events or tactile events because they're systematically modulated by these others. So they're predicted by the other sensory inputs. So for the mental imagery case, I think I could get out by not having this candidate, but I'm sure you could come with another candidate that I would have to examine more thoroughly. That's a fair point.
Okay, so thank you very much. Maybe we can have a time for a 1-minute question for attendee.
Yeah.
There is none, because unfortunately we are run.
Just to repeat, the attendees who are willing to make questions should press the raise hand button. But if there is no
in the meantime, I just have a curiosity. So I'm not an expert on cognitive penetrability. So what are the prediction of the predictive accounts in terms of brain damaged patients or cognitive impaired? And if you ever worked with this kind of patients, because well, intuitively it seems that if the predictive coded account is right, then any sort of impairment in conceptual processing might lead to a sort of might affect visual perception. If you look at the neuropsychological literature, for instance, semantic dementia patients, which has selective damage in conceptual processing, but the visual processing ability is perfectly preserved, and they have compared with intact patients, they have exactly the same kind of color perception, for instance, early color perception. So is there any prediction that the account can do with this kind of patients, and are you planning to?
Yeah, I mean that's there are several people work with predictive models in especially in people in computational psychiatry, and even Carl Friston himself has written a series of papers on clinical cases. To my knowledge, I'll just give you one example. It's not clear that any every damage at any impairment at the cognitive level should have an impairment at the perceptual level, because it could be that all the perceptual processing is dealt with before it needs actually very high level cognitive prediction. So you wouldn't predict a general degradation of all perceptual processing, but certainly some. And so I don't think that this would be a specific problem. The kind of evidence that I know of is exactly in the case I was discussing with Sophia, which is when you ask actually schizophrenic patients who have this general cognitive deficits about the same, how confident they are that the two cues were in conflict or not, they don't see the difference. So it seems that here, healthy patients, healthy controls who were presented with conflicting information at the perceptual level can metacognitively reflect on them, whereas the schizophrenic cannot. And this again is used sometimes to explain why a lot of the perception that will then feed into delusions might be due to the fact that they're not capable of realizing that what they saw was driven by their expectations. So there is a shade in the bushes, and they're convinced that there is a gigantic frog that is spying on them just because these thoughts are in their heads, and they're really convinced that this was coming from the perception itself. Whereas for you and me, if we're not schizophrenic, we might also, out of tiredness or because we were thinking about gigantic uh, frog, think that this is what we saw in the bush, but immediately we have control or we correct and we realize this was very, this was a very non very reliable percept or something like that. So we're capable of eliminating them through the realization partly that they are not reliable and via the exercise of control when we look again, and they wouldn't. So that would be a good example of the strength of a predictive account here to explain the difference between the two.
Okay, thank you very much.
Let us clap again.
And thank you again. And,
keep in mind that the next webinar will involving Jackie Sullivan about optogenetics, progress and pluralism will take place exactly in 2 weeks. Friday the 3rd May at the same time as today. Let us thank once more Ophelia and Henry and Sophia and all the attendees who are left, and have a nice holiday.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Sophia, Henry, Fabrizio, Marco. This was great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
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 Thank you.